And
Hello.
we are live. Greetings, salutations, and of course, welcome to another episode of the World and the World Building Podcast, Alive. It is so nice to have you all joining us today. And of course, welcome, Shireen. It is lovely having you here.
Thank you very much for having me on. I've been excited to chat about creatures.
Me too. We have been trying to arrange this for ages, and there have been so many things that did not work. It is ironic to me that Friday the 13th is the day that our luck held, and we finally managed to get this live stream together. So I met Shireen at Worldcon this year, and we got chatting, and it turns out that she is, among other things, a science communicator and a biology expert, and also an artist and also a world building fan. And I was like, well, we must have a podcast episode with you. And I think since July, we've been trying to put this together and it's been so difficult, but we finally made it. Where are you calling in from, Shireen?
So I'm calling in from Glasgow in Scotland because
Ooh.
I lived where the Worldcon was this year. So
Hey, there we go.
convenient for me. Wish it was
Very
here every
convenient having Worldcon on your doorstep. What's the weather like in Scotland these days?
year. It's actually been a weirdly okay season, but
Nice.
cloudy and rainy today, of course.
Oh, of course, of course. It is, of course, Friday the 13th. Well, let me introduce Shireen properly because she's far too modest to introduce herself. Shireen is an animal artist and creature designer with a background in biology. Deriving inspiration from the natural world, she endeavors to create fantastical beasts with an air of believability, which is really what we're going to be talking about today. Whether that be speculative or alternate evolution on Earth, alien creatures on a faraway planet, or perhaps how a dragon might breathe fire in a fantastical world. More on that later. In addition to her pursuits as an illustrator, she also works as a freelance editor and offers scientific consultation for science fiction and fantasy stories. By the way, guys, if you are looking for a consultant, when she's not helping others with their creative works, she is focusing on her own writing and illustrative projects. You can learn more about her on her website, which I have dropped in the live stream chat and will be available, of course, if you are listening from the future on the podcast, in the podcast comments. Um, I am just so excited about this topic. So I don't want to wait any longer. Let's talk about. But I'm a massive nerd, as everybody here knows. I'm a massive science nerd, massive biology nerd, especially. So I think a useful place to start with this conversation is okay, we're talking about creating creatures. What makes a successful creature from a biological standpoint? What makes a good creature when we're thinking, biologically?
So I'd say there are kind of two main things to kind of consider here. First off, animals in the real world don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in an ecosystem with everything else around them. And the form of those animals through the course of evolution is dictated by what we call biotic and abiotic factors. So biotic factors are other living things and how that will influence how a creature's niche, how it will live. So, for example, what it eats. Is there anything that predates on it? Diseases and parasites, that kind of thing. And the abiotic factors are the physical environment itself. So, what sort of physical limits is this animal evolved to cope with? What biome is it in? Are there any kind of like chemicals or things in the environment that it can take advantage of? The other thing is its evolutionary history. So life on Earth, it's all kind of descended from an ancestral species, and as such, depending on what group of organisms you're looking at, they'll have physical things in common. So, for example, if you're looking at vertebrates, we all have four limbs. If you're looking at, for example, like diapsid reptiles, which would be things like birds, crocodilians, they're all going to have like at least some kind of like two holes in the skull, which is where like the muscles attach. So like if you're sort of designing anatomy and you're like putting it in that group of animals, you need to have some kind of historical remnant. Like these things can like disappear in the course of evolution, but you still need like evidence that they were there.
Yeah.
So essentially, you can't have a design that comes out of nothing. unless you have a reason behind that in the law of your world. So, for example, if a god made it, or if it was sort of, I guess, like super genetic engineered, so it doesn't even bear any remnant of what it originally was, then you can kind of get away from that. But if this is a natural creature that with presumably a history similar to life on Earth, then this is something to kind of keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad that you said that because a lot of, when people think about successful creatures, they think about, what you learned in biology, the three Fs. Uh, and they think about creatures that feed and creatures that mate and pass on their genetic code, but people often forget that there are all of these, as you said, abiotic factors, like what happened to the dinosaurs, for example, or on the flip side, things like the Great Bloom, where all of a sudden there was this like huge blooming in the ocean, and suddenly the whole balance of the ecosystem changed. These are things that world builders love to do. They love to have cataclysms. They love to have these big world events, and they very often forget that is going to have a really interesting impact on their species that they can then use to further the stories, further the impact of the cataclysm that they've already created. It gives more richness if you dig into this area.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, even things like if you do have a cataclysm, because all species are connected. If you have a cataclysm which is going to wipe out something, that's going to have a knock-on effect on everything else, including if you've got any humanoids in the mix. They're not immune from a plant getting taken out and sort of wrecking their food supply. And also, things like if you change the ecological balance, perhaps in your world, if you've got invasive species that, sort of knocked out the balance, if you've got humanoids that have brought in something from some other continent, for example, that can completely change the flora or fauna of, the area that you're basing your story in.
Yeah, absolutely. I was in Hawaii some years ago, and there was a whole nature reserve where they're trying to preserve species from Goa. And essentially, because a snake was introduced, started eating all the native birds fell out, which meant that a lot of the plant species are no longer reproducing as they should. So all of these plant species are now dying out. And they're experiencing this sort of catastrophic collapse of all of their native species because one type of bird got eaten by snakes.
It's called an
introduced.
extinction. It's called an extinction cascade. And when you sort of take out, it's particularly if it's like a keystone species, which means that they're very, very important within that community. It can, I can't remember the exact number, but it's like a few thousand years. It's like 5,000 years or something for like the ecosystem to settle down again. And for like a lot of these islands, particularly in the Pacific, it's been nowhere near that period of time. So we can expect like a lot more are going to disappear, sadly.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, somebody in the chat says, I only want scientific sense to get me halfway there, although this will still be good to hear. Nice to see you, Valentine. Welcome. These are mechanisms that you can use. So it doesn't have to be exactly the right amount of time. It doesn't have to be exactly the thing. But these are mechanisms you can use to inform your world building and make your world feel not real, because we're not trying to create something real, but make it feel authentic, make it feel like something that rings true in a way.
Yeah, and I would say as well, like the general advice that I give to writers is to know when to stop with the science as well, because if we knew all of these answers for some of this is included for if you're trying to create technology and stuff as well. Like if we knew exactly how this worked, we'd probably have it. So it's like, you want to put in just that little bit of detail to kind of give that realism, but then dial it back, not too much that people like me can come along and say that's not like that's not how it works. You just want like that little bit of, that little hint in there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked about what makes a creature successful. I'm going to flip that on its head. What makes a good monster, and how is that different?
So in terms of what makes a good monster? I would say that's definitely kind of going a bit more into human psychology and what we find scary. And I would say that kind of comes under two main brackets. Either predatory, scary animal that probably ate our ancestors on the plains, or something that's like really uncanny and it looks really, really strange.
Yeah.
I think like with the uncanny ones, particularly if it's not a vertebrate, it doesn't have four legs, and you've got some really weird kind of foreign looking anatomy there, particularly, but it's vertebrate size. I think that's definitely something that can be quite terrifying, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of theory about this, but I think from a biological perspective, we think about successful creatures as creatures who are working well in their environment. I think when you get to monsters, often when you meet them, it's on a bad day. Like either you've
Mm.
gone into their territory for some reason. There is some reason why this is a monster that people aren't encountering all the time, right? There's a reason that this is something that is scary and strange and different. So either you're going into its territory and it is very well adapted to its territory and you are not, or it's a monster that's having a really bad day because for some reason it's in your space. When we
Yeah.
think about human settlements, they're designed to keep dangerous animals and dangerous creatures out. So if the dangerous creatures and the people are meeting, um, you need to think, is this a monster that's somehow been portaled in? Is this an owlbear that's come from the fairy realm and been dropped in the middle of a market? Then that is a very bewildered monster. That is a monster that is going to cause carnage, whether it wants to or not, because it's completely inappropriate for that environment. And that is very interesting and scary. But it's also interesting and scary to go into the Feywild and encounter an owlbear in its environment where it is completely attuned to it, and you stick out like a chocolate teapot on a you know in a forest. So I think there's something very interesting there about the environment in which you find the monster as much as the monster itself, which
Yeah,
tells
I
you so
completely
much about
agree.
how they react and how you react.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, like, there's a big difference seeing like a tiger at a distance and having it right behind you.
Yeah, absolutely. And you expect to go into uh the wilderness where there are tigers and see a tiger, and that is very scary. You do not expect to go into somebody's basement and find a tiger, and that is also very scary in a very different way. Um, and I think that what a lot of people forget is that kind of contextuality of monsters, which is deeply biological because it's about adaptation.
Mhm. Yeah, no, absolutely. My
Um,
cough is starting to be annoying.
oh,
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, everybody. I've got a bit of a cold at the moment, but I'm coping. I'm okay.
I think there's another misconception here with good monsters. A lot of people think good monsters are apex predators. What is your opinion on that?
Not necessarily. I think I'd be a bit more scared of a parasite, to be honest. I think,
Yeah.
or some kind of something that can make you like sick.
Yeah.
And also, I guess again, it depends. Any animal, if you don't know what it is and you don't know what its behavior is, can be very scary. You can have something that's large but herbivorous. I wouldn't
Hippos.
want to. I wouldn't be want to get in front of like an angry rhino or an elephant or something. That or a hippo. I think that's one of the most dangerous animals in Africa, and that is a herbivore. So they don't have to be apex predators. Definitely not.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes small creatures are terrifying, like scorpions. Like there's a lot to be said for, different kinds of monsters. You don't just have to think big and teethy. There's a lot of variety. And again, if you're in a forest and you suddenly realize that the floor is moving and it's all scorpions.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the sort of the apex predator type monster is a little bit overdone, and I think like particularly if you're like looking at other clades of animals and seeing if you can sort of take features of those, you can make a much more interesting kind of monster.
Yeah.
there's some scary things in the arthropod world,
Oh,
so
goodness.
like insects, spiders, scorpions, etc.
Marine arthropods are the stuff of my nightmares.
Yeah, they can be a bit scary, can't they? Yeah. But I don't know. I mean, like when it comes to apex predators, I mean, I love my felines and my canines, so to me they just look cute.
Yeah,
They don't look like monsters to me.
I think that leads us very nicely to my next question, which is what are some other common biological mistakes world builders make with their creatures? So what are the things that make you as a knowledgeable biologist go, what? How does that work? Or wait, what's going on here? Like what are those things for you?
So like the big one is probably the size. The size in a lot of respects. So, and again, it's fantasy and science fiction, so I have to have some tolerance. But if you've got like a creature that is absolutely gargantuan, I appreciate it if there's some thought into how it's that gargantuan. I have some pretty gargantuan creatures in my own, sort of stories. So it's not like you can't have them. But sometimes, sort of people, particularly with flight, they'll make a gargantuan animal, but they won't really think about how that's actually going to get off the ground. But there are ways. There can be ways, but generally they're not like designed that way. Or it can be something like, what does this animal eat? Again, this doesn't need to matter so much if you've got something that's in the realms of the supernatural, but if it's an organic creature that I'm going to assume has evolved in this world, it needs to have a niche. It needs to have a place in that world. So, what is it eating and how has it got so big? Another thing would be how form is related to function. So sometimes, you'll have like these really over-designed creatures. Sometimes it's like, but why do they look like that? What's the purpose in all this? And again, it's like the limits, there aren't really that many limits. Like you can sort of argue around most of these things, but so for example, you can have like very strange looking ornaments on an animal. If you just say, oh, it's sexual selection, like peacock tails don't make much sense, for example. But I always appreciate if there's some reference to it.
Yeah, no, I totally understand what you mean. Some kind of explanation, some kind of like, we know they use them as a mating display, or like they fall off when it's out of season or whatever, this kind of thing. I think
exactly.
I don't know that this is necessarily a mistake, but a lot of people forget those other behaviors of creatures. Like a lot of people think about attack and hunting and eating. A lot of people forget about, territorial protection and nesting and, training their little baby ones to do things. Like, I'm scared of a tiger, but I'm more scared of a mama tiger with a baby tiger. And I'm even more scared of, a tiger in training, if you see what I mean. And I think, again, sometimes there is not a reason why the monster is interested in you. Like, and people use too much it wants to eat you. But I think there aren't enough instances in stories where like there is this terrifying monster, but it's just not interested in you right now because it's much more interested in, a courting ritual that it's trying to do or whatever. They always present the monster as the monster wants to eat you. This is what the monster wants to do. The monster has other things going on in its life, right? Like, sorry, Susan, you are not the most important thing in this monster's life at all times.
Absolutely. I mean, like another thing as well that I think like sometimes people don't really think about is that animals generally are very violence averse. Because like if an animal gets injured in the wild, that's usually a death sentence.
Yeah, it's
so
high risk.
Animals only attack if they really, really have to do it. So when you like kind of see like two cats and they're like having a standoff, and like they're just sort of it's all posturing. They're just like
looking at each other like this and howling.
They're staring at each other like their fur is all on end. but like they only, come into conflict if they can't resolve their disagreement. One of them won't back down and they can't resolve their disagreement in any other way. So these monsters and animals, they shouldn't be just attacking for no reason. If they're going to attack with passion if they're sort of defending their offspring. I'd quite like to see more kind of story incidences of basically monster misunderstandings. You kind of you sort of went and saw this essentially a mother bear, and that's why it killed you, opposed to that it's just likes killing things for no particular reason.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a lot more there, but we probably should move on. Let's talk about your personal favorite interpretations. We talked about common mistakes. Let's go the other way. What are some things that you were like, that's really interesting, or that's really clever, or that's a very good example of such and such? Some things that sort of pleasantly surprised you or you really enjoyed.
Hey, so I like to complain a lot. So like I'm quite hard to please. So yeah, thinking about this one. So one of my favorite series is actually the Dragon Riders of Pern, and I quite like the dragons in the Dragon Riders of Pern for a few reasons. Like not perfect, but I do quite like a lot of aspects about them. One thing that I like is that all of the kind of native fauna of Pern all have 6 limbs. I like that because that sort of creates that evolutionary unity that I was sort of talking about earlier. And that just kind of gives that sort of more of that essence of believability, that there's a logic behind why the animals look the way that they do. So in the same way that we all have 4 limbs as vertebrates on Earth, they all have 6 limbs on Pern. So I like that. I like that they're huge dragons, but they fly. But there's a bit of a hint that they're using some sort of psychic ability to be able to do that. Again, I don't need to know how the psychic ability works. I just like the fact that there is some kind of explanation to how these really large animals are able to do that. I don't need a detailed explanation of how does telekinesis work or whatever. I don't need that. But it is always appreciated though when there is some kind of acknowledgement of how a creature is getting around some kind of what would normally be a biological constraint of some kind.
I have 2 actually two recent examples that I really enjoyed. For those of you who have seen or know Delicious in Dungeon, I was really pleasantly surprised by the animated armor in that series, because the whole series is sort of about like how a dungeon ecosystem really works. So it had me from the get-go. It's also about food, which also had me from the get-go. And some of the stuff is a bit of a reach, but they essentially, spoiler alert, they have animated armor that is it's got mollusks in it. It's got mollusks living on the inside of the armor, and that's how it's animated. And essentially they sort of grow ligaments to move it like puppets, essentially.
Oh, that sounds pretty interesting. Maybe I should watch that.
It's really cute and interesting. And it's like just about in the realms of, fantasy biology. Okay, I can see this. It's a really nice explanation for a trope, which is, armor that moves around by magic. Which might be haunted armor or, animated or whatever. I thought that was really cute, really original. I love the idea of the mollusks using it as a shell as well, like a hermit crab almost. Just such a sort of clever take on a trope. And I think the other one for me is the kaiju in the Kaiju Preservation Society by John Scalzi, where he goes into a lot of detail about how these kaiju work. It is mad. All right, they have basically like little nuclear reactors inside them. They've evolved to have nuclear fusion as part of nuclear fission as part of their core biology, which explains, and they use parasites to deal with essentially the problem that they would completely overheat because they're huge, right? Their parasites are a cooling mechanism for them, so they're covered in these parasites. The whole thing is put together in such a credible yet fantastical way that really drew me in. So those are my two that I will be like, I hold these up. Gold standard. You had me intrigued and you explained enough, and they really dug into the biology concepts. Made me very happy.
I'll have to check those out.
I really enjoyed them both, and I was surprised by them both.
So, I have heard of them both, but yeah, I never got to see them.
So I guess one of the things that we've been talking about is, creatures that are suited to their environments. Can we talk a little bit about biomes and how creatures can be suited to their various biomes and sort of how you can show that within the creature design?
Yeah, sure. So it's always a good idea to kind of take inspiration from the real world and have a look at animals which are already like living in the kind of biome that you're wanting to replicate. Looking at any kind of paleontological creatures as well for that extra bit of flair. But as a few kind of general things to think about, I kind of mentioned earlier about how form is sort of always related to function. So if you were kind of going to take, say, like an Arctic biome, for example, well, there's very simple, there's simple things like, sort of camouflage, for example. So if it's, if it's a creature that's going to be in the snow a lot, it's, might have like white fur, which it might shed in the spring and kind of get some brown fur or something like that. If it's in a jungle, it might have patterning to kind of mimic the kind of dappled light, that kind of thing. As well as that, as I was saying, if it's in like a very cold Arctic area, the animals are going to tend to be larger. So we have this kind of surface area to volume ratio principle. So larger animals do better because they're going to lose less heat because they've got a larger volume to their surface area. But they're also going to have features like very small ears to reduce heat loss. So if you kind of like think of like an Arctic fox and a fennec fox and a regular kind of fox you might find in the UK, see their ears kind of get like a set larger as the further south they go. And that's just like a heat saving mechanism pretty much.
Yeah, in the same way that elephants have very large ears so that they can lose heat, because when you're in Africa and you're a very large creature, you really want to lose as much heat as you can, as quickly as you can.
Exactly. So you kind of have to sort of think that the biome is going to create physical constraints on the animal, and how has its physiology evolved to adapt to those constraints. However, sometimes it's not necessarily the physiology, but it's the behavior. So humans are a very interesting case here because we have managed to get around our physiological limitations by inventing things like clothing. So we're using our intelligence is the adaptation to be able to exist in a different biome. So you can kind of think like a little bit more out of the box in that kind of way. Are there any sort of like behaviors that have allowed an animal to like conquer a new biome that it's not actually really very well adapted to?
Yeah. Again, elephants are a perfect example. So elephants, again, you know more about this than me, but for the audience, the only place we still have megafauna in our world is Africa, which is ironic because usually very large creatures don't do very well in hot places, but that's where they survived here. Elephants make themselves mud caps to keep them cool. They are intelligent creatures. They scoop up mud and splat it on their heads because it cools them down and it also stops them getting sunburnt. So that is an intelligent adaptation from a non-sapient but clearly intelligent creature, and that's the kind of thing that like you can totally do with your creatures. Like, do they take baths? Do they change their behavior patterns? Do they migrate to the shade in the summer and come out into the non-shady place in the winter? Like, these are very easy adaptations to add for, if you don't want them to be like sapient and make clothing and have language and stuff, but you still want to show an adaptation, that's a way that you can do that.
Yeah, or something, like hibernation or torpor, which is like basically like kind of daily hibernation, kind of to sort of like escape particularly harsh conditions. So, if you have like in your world, if you have like maybe some weather cycles or something that are really, really intense, the animals might just be inactive during those periods, whereas other animals might be super well adapted to kind of cope with it instead.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about diet, because again, that's a thing that can make a big difference in the way a creature looks. And as you said, it's all about function. Everything that is aesthetic is also functional somehow. So how can diet affect that?
So again, we've got the simple things. If you are a carnivorous creature, you're probably going to have sharp teeth. Again, though, it's not a consistent rule. Humans break this rule. So we are, what the scientific term is, like obligate, I think, processivores. I'm going to say obligate cookers. So we cook stuff. So like, the use of fire and cooking is inherent in our biology. Like we have evolved to make use of that. So our digestive systems and our teeth haven't become as carnivorous as your typical carnivorous mammal because we have bypassed that with a different adaptation. So again, like there are not necessarily hard and fast rules. You can be kind of creative in the way that animals will adapt to this sort of thing. But in terms of diets, the big one is teeth, as well as like, the digestive system as well. But, like sauropod dinosaurs, long neck, presumably for leaves or something, those kind of things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to share 3 examples of creatures that eat ants completely differently. Is that okay? This is something I'm so excited about this. Sorry. The first one is chimpanzees, who will take a stick and put it so the ants climb up it and then lick the stick. A very simple way of using a very simple tool to eat ants. The second, of course, is the anteater that takes their giant claws and rips open the ant mound, the nest, and then uses their little licky tongue to lick in the crevices and eat all the delicious anties. It's great being an anteater. It's awesome. You get to eat ants. It's great. And the third is possibly my favorite. It is the climbing perch. This is a fish. It climbs trees. So it will climb out the water up a tree and wait for the ants to walk over it and then leap back into the water. And then, of course, the ants will float to the surface.
Yeah.
And then it can just eat the little ants. Ants apparently are delicious in nature. This is one of the things that we learned. But the other thing is there are many different ways to eat an ant, and there are many different ways to evolve to eat ants. And I think that's...
I've actually eaten ants and they're gross. I don't understand why they like them.
I don't know what the fuss is about. Why is everyone eating these things?
Basically, like imagine salt coated in acid. That's what an ant tastes like. Apparently, they're good seasoning.
Okay, I can see that. I have not personally eaten ants, but I do find it interesting that there are so many different ways that we can see in nature that different species have evolved to eat the same food.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's one of those wonderful those wonderful moments where you can say, okay, look at this spectacular this spectacular nature. There's so much inspiration.
I mean, like the chimp and the anteater was very similar to what I was saying. Very similar example to what I was saying about human cooking and, like a tiger having sort of teeth and a shorter digestive system. It's basically like the anteater has evolved to have the stick, essentially. Like that's part of its morphology, so it can just utilize it. Whereas the chimp hasn't got, like that long snout, that long tongue, and like those really big claws. But it does have intelligence and, hands to be able to kind of manipulate tools. I do think this is something that, we really underestimate with humans as well, that it's not just our intelligence. Without our opposable thumbs, we wouldn't be able to use that intelligence at all. Like dexterity is extremely important in any species that is going to use tools. And like dolphins or even like corvids are kind of limited by their dexterity.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Another creature that, uses its intelligence. We have a lot of crows around here, and they find walnuts because walnuts grow in Greece where I live, and they will just drop them from a great height. And sometimes you could be walking along, and this walnut lands next to you, and you're like, ah, which is funnily enough what the crow says as well. And yeah, they're just trying to break them open by dropping them from a great height. It's very smart. It's a very good way to get into a walnut. It's low effort. And then there are other creatures that can peck them open and various other things.
Yeah, I love crows and the
Yeah,
corvids generally. Like, they're great fun to watch.
absolutely. I think egg eaters are very interesting. There's a lot of creatures some creatures just like dislocate their jaw to get in. Like I'm thinking snakes,
Mm.
for example, that eat eggs, which are relatively common. Um, and then other creatures kind of peck their way in and then eat the insides. Um, so again, like there's a lot of different ways you can go for the same food. And I think one of the interesting things that you can do in a world is if you have a food source like ants in your biome, have two or three different creatures that eat them in two or three different interesting ways. It gives so much richness to your environment,
Yeah, for
and so
sure.
much like weird interest, to your world.
I think like birds in particular are just really interesting in this as well. Like they have so many different beak morphologies.
Mm.
So like if you're designing any kind of creatures and you want them to have a beak, sort of check out all the different birds and what they eat and what kind of beak they have for a specific purpose. I think like I definitely see like a lot of like creatures which almost just like default to the raptor sort of style beak,
Yeah.
but there are so many different beaks.
I just saw a very great comment in the chat that has led to our next question, which is, what about protection for monsters? This could be taken wrong. I don't mean that. Get your mind out the gutter. I'm talking about armor. I'm talking about spikes. How can we stop other things eating our monsters, or stop other monsters of the same species trying to take a bite out of it? What are some of our options there?
Okay, so dinosaurs are a good one for this.
Mm.
So having a lot of like spines and spikes. In terms of mammals, really, really tough skin.
Mm.
So like a lot of animals have very, very, very thick leather that is difficult for a predator to get through. So rhinos being an example of that one. I'm trying to think of anything else. But yeah, I mean, spines, of course.
Yeah.
So porcupines have like a lot of spines.
Yeah.
I think like a fun one to do would be, if you can have some kind of toxin, you know,
Yes.
poisons. I mean, like, so a lot of animals, they have like warning colors. It's like the opposite of camouflage. So if you want a really colorful animal, you can like make it toxic.
Yeah.
So something like a tree frog, very very vulnerable, but it displays all these warning colors because if you
Yeah.
eat it, then you just die. And then some other animals can evolve mimicry to this in low levels. So insects, for example, you have like a lot of like yellow and black striped insects, like hoverflies. They're harmless, but they might be a wasp. So you're going to stay really, really far away from those. So these species that are mimicking, there's like a very delicate balance because they can't exist in too high a number because then the predators will figure out, oh, actually, these are already tasty. So you need you need the actual dangerous ones to be at a high enough level that the mimics can kind of, escape. So,
Fly under the radar. Yeah.
exactly. So you can have like, this very kind of obvious armor, like the thick skin, like sort of, horns and spines, or you can, yeah, have like toxins or mimicry as well.
Yeah. Another really interesting way that monsters protect themselves is being gross. Just being really disgusting. So echidnas are a great example of this. Not only do
Mm.
they have spines, they also poop on the spines, and they do that intentionally to make them more gross when they stab people with them. So they're more
There is
likely to
that,
burn
yeah.
victims. The other
So,
one is Komodo dragons, which have such disgusting teeth that when they bite you, the wound will fester because their teeth are gross. Um,
mm.
they don't have a venom, although I think recently they discovered they do have maybe a mild venom. Maybe I think that was a thing I read
I'm
recently.
not sure. I've heard both for
Huh?
Komodo dragons. I'm not an expert on those lizards either, so
Yeah.
I'd have to look that up. I mean, another one, I was actually saving this for the dragons at the end, but the bombardier beetle, which
Yes.
sprays a very, very hot, noxious fluid that can kill any insects that are gonna sort of attempt to bother it.
Oh yes, there's also the of course I can't remember what it's called. There is a kind of shrimp that can spray boiling water at people. Can I
Oh, is
remember what
there?
it's called? I cannot remember what it's called, but it sprays water with such a force that it boils as it comes out. And
Oh,
this
wow. That
obviously is a great protection when you are a delicious shrimp. So
sounds a bit similar to the bombardier beetle.
yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
But yeah, like acid or something that you can spray with force to keep people away from you. These are all really interesting mechanisms that you can use.
I mean, I think like
And
some squids use ink as well to act as a a distraction or
yeah,
a cloak. So I mean, again, it's like it's kind of a bit like when you're sort of coming up with your RPG character. Really, do you want to go for the stealth stat? Do you want to go for the high defense? Do
yeah.
is an offense a good defense to you? I mean, like sort of you get animals doing all kinds of different strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we see this more in, herd animals, but it's very often that like one animal will be a lookout while the other animals are grazing or whatever. So remember, sometimes your protection is your buddies. Um,
Yeah,
and
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 some
you
species
can
even have symbiotic relationships with that as well. So, like you'll have like, for example, like a bird species, which is like looking in a certain area, and then you might have like a low dwelling, like a meerkat or something, which is like looking at a
yeah.
lower level. So that's quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can start to create very interesting things. And again, like going back to the idea of storytelling, your character who's attuned with nature will say, there's a crow up there that's cawing, and everybody will be like, who cares? And they'll be like, no, that crow is a lookout for dot dot dot, whatever the thing is that we care about. And that's doing a bunch of
Mm.
things. That's showing world building, that's showing character skill, that's showing, some characters are aware, some characters aren't aware. Those kinds of moments give you so much. That's world building that's in motion, it's world building that's emotional, it's world building that's giving you character and plot and progression and mood. Those are the kinds of moments that you can use. You can really leverage your world building for a great moment. And that's why we do this. That's why we care about these things, right? Because at the end of the day, they help us tell really interesting stories that will vibe with our audience in a way that feels true, even though, of course, we are talking about, dragons and fairies and space aliens and everything else. Um, I got a little bit off topic. The mantis shrimp, by the way, what I was thinking of. Thank you very much, Secondhand Samurai, for reading my mind and brain fruit and allowing me to actually say exactly what I meant. Um, we've talked briefly about this, and we've talked about you know, uh, monsters. They don't just want to eat you, Susan. They've got other things going on. But what kinds of behaviors and motivations do people forget about when they're creating their creatures? And how can we use those in the stories? I think you already mentioned the idea of the peacock tail, the idea of, courting markings and this kind of thing. I think that's an interesting place to start.
Yeah, so I mean, for any species, the biological currency is reproductive success. That's the goal for any life form, and everything an animal does is generally kind of motivated to that goal. Even if it's attacking you or wanting to eat you, in the back of its head, it's still it's doing that to reproduce. If it's eating you, it's getting energy to make its eggs. If it's attacking you because you're a threat to its young, then it's protecting its young. So a lot of behaviors that I think people kind of forget about, they are related to that. So, things like courtship behaviors, animals have a huge range of different types of courtship behaviors that they do. Is the animal a social animal? Does it have altruistic behavior? Is it raising its young, and how does it do that? Is it this kind of whole K or strategist, R strategist thing, which is like, are they investing in just a very few small number of offspring, like, an orangutan, for example, raises its offspring for about like 9 years? Or is it just producing as many babies as it can, like a rabbit, but not really investing in any of them that much? So yeah, behaviors related to reproduction. More of those, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that's often forgotten is the learning of the youngers of the species. So a young, whatever it is, that is learning to play, learning to fly. Do you know what? I do not want to be in the flight path of a dragon that is learning to fly. That sounds terrifying. A lot of species play to learn. A lot of species, um, they they they're getting information, they're trying things out, often not very successfully. And I think that that's a very interesting thing, because that's when a lot of things could go wrong. When do people find birds and adopt them? When they fall out the nest. Like that, that's also interesting. And if you were interested in telling a narrative about, a monster that's really scary, but also, could there be a bridge between you? Is there that, a different flavor of man and nature working together, maybe, or something? I think that's really interesting. Oh, we found one in the woods and it was all alone and we adopted it, or we found one in the woods, it was all alone, we adopted it, and now it's eaten Granny. These are interesting stories, and these are interesting ways that you can, bring in these behaviors, bring in these sort of learning behaviors as well.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Yeah. Melville says, do babies imprint? That's also an interesting question. Yeah.
Depends on the species. So imprinting is something that the birds definitely do, but like a lot of species, they don't even know who their parents are. They'll just be abandoned from birth. So depends on what kind of animal you're creating, but absolutely they can.
Yeah. There's a lot of talk about dinosaurs in the chat, because the chat, like me, are obsessed with dinosaurs. Uh-huh. I think dinosaurs would imprint. They're bird-like, right?
Yeah, quite possibly. Yeah, quite possibly. I mean, like, birds are dinosaurs, so we can assume that a lot of the behaviors that modern birds have, dinosaurs would have as well. At least the kind of later theropod dinosaurs, which birds are, in that group.
Yeah.
In terms of like the more distantly related ones, who knows? But there is definitely a lot of evidence of parental care in dinosaurs.
No. I now in my head have an image of a T-Rex on a giant log doing one of those incredible courtship dances where it's like jumping from one side to the other side and just destroying everything in its path. There's no reason why large creatures would not have hugely destructive courtship rituals. There's no reason why they wouldn't build nests by like picking up whole houses and incorporating them into these nests. There's no reason why you can't do that, and I think it sounds amazing. Please, somebody write this. I don't have time. Please, somebody write this. Where's the castle gone? Oh, well, there was a nesting dragon, and it just sort of picked it up and flew away. And apparently,
just demolishing it one brick at a time.
Yeah, exactly. Like first it came for the slates, and then it came for the beams, and then it came for the rocks, and now it's got its own very nicely built nest somewhere. But why not? Like, why aren't dragons building giant nests?
Yeah,
if they're alien species,
Even the thing about like the sort of the hoarding behavior in dragons, I really like it when that's sort of linked to a kind of a courtship behavior.
Yeah.
Sort of birds do that kind of thing as well, sort of, with presenting mates with things that they've seen. So I think that's sweet. If the dragon's like, making its big hoard because this is a nest to impress a female or something.
Yeah. I found this beautiful shiny thing, and it drops it, and it's just like a dead knight in plate mail armor or something. Look, it's a snack and a shiny thing.
Sounds pretty
Yeah.
good if you're a dragon.
Yeah, there you are. It's a two-in-one gift. I'm sorry, I get too excited about these things. I do not want to miss the chance to have an answer to this question. So, what is a biological explanation for how dragons could breathe fire? I was promised this. I am here
Oh,
for
you
it.
promised
I am
this.
excited. Share with us, Shireen. What are your thoughts?
So as I sort of said before, like you want to kind of know how much information to give while not giving away too much. So that there are a few different kind of avenues which you could go down with this. So I have fire-breathing creatures in some of my stories. The route that I take is similar to the bombardier beetle, that they have a flammable venom. So the way that I kind of do it is that they have like sort of two chambers with different chemicals, and then they can put the chemicals together, spit it out, perhaps using like an enzyme or a catalyst to kind of get the reaction going. And it's like a highly flammable material in the presence of oxygen. So that would be that's kind of the way that I'm sort of doing it. But where you don't want to go too far unless you're actually a chemist is maybe saying exactly what those materials are. In terms of the bombardier beetle, it doesn't breathe fire, but it does do something kind of similar where it kind of mixes chemicals, two different ones, puts them in a little chamber in its body. And then in the presence of a catalyst, they heat almost to a boiling point of water, produce a lot of gas, which then shoots it under pressure out of the beetle. Another way you could potentially do it would be to kind of have the dragon maybe breathe hydrogen. I'm not so keen on that one myself because you need like some other kind of ignition mechanism for it. So yeah, but I think like it's a little bit less reliable.
Yeah.
So,
The
but
dragon
I have
sat there going like ang, 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 before
yeah.
it can breathe fire. I think that kind of takes away the fear of it somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I have heard people kind of like do the hydrogen one. They like it because it has the side effect that hydrogen might help them float a little bit as well. But that is another way you could do it, but you might have to think about the ignition mechanism. There could be ways. I mean, I like electric eels can make sparks, so that could be something to sort of heat it. But yeah, I like to go for the flammable venom. You could also, I have like a few different fire breathers. One of the fire breathers I have is that they can only breathe fire over a certain air temperature. So if it's too cold, then it won't auto ignite, which is like limitations to powers. I like quite a lot because you can get some nice like story elements that way.
We have a whole video about the triangle of power and bringing in costs and limitations to your world building. So yes, absolutely that.
Yeah, definitely the case with creatures and any kind of like humanoids as well that kind of have any sort of that aren't human. I mean, animals essentially can have superpowers if they're in the right environment. So, having like, if you've got particularly, if you do have a humanoid, but they can only do their special thing in the environment that they're adapted to, and they're pretty useless elsewhere. I like that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes a lot of sense, in terms of the biology of it too. It also kind of, when we think about fire breathing creatures, it also brings us back to where we started, which is the idea of, cataclysms and how, the world can change and creatures need to change with it. If your fire breathing dragon is suddenly in an oxygen richer or oxygen poorer environment, what is that going to do? We know the level of oxygen has changed in our world at some point. So what if there was a cataclysm? How would that affect, other creatures, but also those abilities? That's
Yeah,
really interesting.
definitely. And I said, like, even depending on how you went down the fire breathing angle, even things like some kind of change to the climate could have like a big difference.
Yeah.
Or, you know, again, if you wanted to have like anything that was sort of temperature dependent, and you know, you've got people who are maybe wanting to be very mean and kill this dragon, they might go after it at night or after it in the winter when it's, you know, not able to breathe fire so effectively.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you know, these are interesting. When do you hunt a dragon? When it's cold, when it's hibernating, because you know, it's a lizard, so it doesn't want to be around when it's cold. That's the time that you find it and hit it, right? That's an interesting setup. That's an interesting world building setup for a story as well. Yeah, I have enjoyed this so much, Shirin. Thank you so very much for coming to join us today.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me on. It's been very fun.
This has been such an exciting conversation. And folks in the chat, thank you so much for sharing as well. Evan Arick says, I'm explaining my species breathing fire with a gland in near the larynx. It sounds like we've been inspiring people already. And folks, World Ember is still, as of recording time, going on 10,000 words in December. So maybe we're going to see some new intriguing and interesting species
Oh, that'd be fun.
inspired by biology. I hope so. But of course, the fun is not over yet. Why? Because we have a video premiere today. What is the Cobra effect? That's what we're talking about, and how can it help your world building? Yes, it does have cobras in it. Yes, it is somewhat related to the stream, and I think it's going to be super helpful for you all. So please do come join us over on the, can I find the link, over on the YouTube right now, where we're going to be kicking off that premiere. Yeah, that's us. That's a wrap. So folks, you know what to do. Grab your hammer and go world build. See you soon. Bye.